The wind cut like broken glass across Elena Morrison's face as she pulled her worn coat tighter around her thin frame. Christmas Eve in northern Minnesota, and the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero. Her breath came out in white clouds that froze almost instantly, tiny ice crystals catching what little light remained in the late afternoon sky. Beside her, huddled against her leg, 7-year-old Sophie clutched a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days, its fur matted and one ear hanging by threads. They'd been walking for 3 hours since the shelter turned them away. Full capacity, the woman at the desk had said, her eyes apologetic but her tone final. Try the church on Riverside. But the church had been full too, and so had the community center, and now Elena found herself doing what she'd sworn she'd never do. Walking into the wilderness with her daughter, searching for any kind of shelter that might keep them alive through the night. The town of Frost Lake, population 900 and declining, sat 30 miles from anything resembling civilization. It had been a mining town once, back when copper still flowed from the hills and men could make decent wages working underground. But the mines closed in 1987, and the town had been dying slowly ever since. Those who could leave had left. Those who remained survived on disability checks, seasonal tourism, and the kind of stubborn pride that refused to admit defeat. Elena had come here 6 months ago with nothing but hope and a referral for a job that turned out not to exist. The woman who'd promised her work at a bed and breakfast had sold the property and moved to Arizona without bothering to inform anyone. By the time Elena arrived, homeless and nearly broke, winter was already closing in. She'd managed to find work cleaning vacation rentals, but the tourist season was short this far north, and when it ended, so did her income. Now, it was Christmas Eve, and she had $43 in her pocket, a daughter who deserved so much better, and nowhere to go. Sophie stumbled, her small boots slipping on ice-crusted snow. Elena caught her automatically, muscles remembering the countless times she'd prevented falls, soothed fears, promised that things would get better even when she had no idea if that was true. "Mama, I'm cold," Sophie whispered, her voice small and defeated. "I know, baby. Just a little further." "Where are we going?" Elena didn't have an answer. She'd been following the old logging road that wound north from town, hoping it might lead to an abandoned cabin or a hunting shelter, anything with walls and a roof. The forest pressed in on both sides, dark pines heavy with snow, their branches creating a tunnel that blocked what little daylight remained. In another hour, it would be completely dark, and the temperature would drop even further. She'd made so many mistakes to end up here. Trusted the wrong man, believed his promises, followed him to a city where she knew no one. By the time she realized he was dangerous, she was pregnant and trapped. She'd left anyway, running with nothing but a bag of clothes and the fierce determination to give her child a better life than the one she'd grown up in. For a while, it had worked. She'd found steady work as a bookkeeper in Minneapolis, saved money, enrolled Sophie in a good preschool. Then the company downsized, and Elena's position was eliminated. Without a college degree, without professional connections, without family to fall back on, she'd spiraled downward faster than she'd thought possible. Eviction, then shelters, then the desperate move to Frost Lake, chasing a job that didn't exist. The mistakes piled up like snow, each one burying her a little deeper. "Mama, look!" Sophie pointed ahead, her mittened hand emerging from beneath Elena's coat where she'd tucked it for warmth. Elena stopped, squinting through the gathering darkness. At first, she saw nothing but trees and snow. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she made out a shape in the distance. Something large, angular, rising above the forest like a broken tooth. They walked toward it, Elena's heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. As they drew closer, the shape resolved into a structure, massive and impossible, sitting in a clearing that nature was slowly reclaiming. It was a castle. Not a real castle, Elena realized as they approached, but someone's vision of one. Built from gray stone that must have been quarried locally, it rose 3 stories high with turrets at each corner and narrow windows that stared out like empty eyes. The architecture was Gothic, elaborate, completely out of place in the Minnesota wilderness. Snow had drifted against its walls, and ice hung from the eaves in jagged sheets. It looked abandoned, forgotten, and absolutely frozen. "It's like a fairy tale," Sophie breathed, momentarily forgetting her misery. Elena studied the structure more carefully. The windows on the ground floor were boarded up, but the boards looked old, weathered gray by years of exposure. The main entrance, a massive wooden door set beneath a pointed arch, was partially blocked by snow but appeared intact. No tracks led to or from the building. No smoke rose from any chimney. Whatever this place was, it had been empty for a long time. She thought about turning back, trying to make it back to town before dark. But town offered nothing except more locked doors and apologetic rejections. At least here, there might be shelter. "Stay close to me," she told Sophie, taking her daughter's hand. They approached the castle carefully, Elena testing each step before putting her full weight down. The snow was deeper here, undisturbed except by wind and falling branches. When they reached the main door, Elena tried the handle. Locked as expected. She moved along the wall, checking windows, looking for any way in. On the east side of the building, she found it. One of the ground floor windows had been boarded up like the others, but the wood had rotted through in one corner, creating a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through if they were desperate enough. Elena was desperate enough. She pulled at the rotten wood, pieces crumbling in her hands. The gap widened. She hoisted Sophie through first, then squeezed through herself, her coat catching on nails and splinters. They dropped into darkness, landing on a floor that felt solid beneath their feet. Elena pulled out the small flashlight she kept in her pocket, one of the few possessions she'd managed to hold on to through all the moves and losses. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a grand entrance hall that took her breath away. The ceiling soared overhead, supported by thick wooden beams carved with intricate patterns. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel decorated with frozen gargoyles. The floor was made of slate, covered in dust and debris, but still beautiful in its geometric precision. A staircase swept upward, its iron railings twisted into shapes that suggested roses and thorns. "Wow," Sophie whispered, her voice echoing in the empty space. The castle was freezing, barely warmer than outside, but at least they were out of the wind. Elena explored quickly, her flashlight beam sweeping across frozen grandeur. Room after room revealed the same story: expensive materials, elaborate craftsmanship, and complete abandonment. Furniture remained in some rooms, shrouded in sheets that had gone stiff with cold and age. In what must have been a library, bookshelves still held volumes too frozen to open. A dining room contained a table that could seat 20, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. Everywhere Elena looked, she saw money. Not just wealth, but the kind of extravagant spending that seemed to serve no purpose except display. Who built a castle in the Minnesota wilderness? Why? And why they abandoned it so completely? She found bedrooms on the second floor, their four-poster beds still made up with linens that had frozen solid over winter after winter. In one room, a vanity held cosmetics containers that must have been expensive decades ago, now just frozen relics. A closet revealed dresses hanging like ghosts, their fabrics preserved by the cold. "Mama, I found something." Sophie's voice came from down the hall. Elena hurried to find her daughter, standing in front of another room, this one different from the others. The door was smaller, simpler, tucked into an alcove that seemed designed to be overlooked. Unlike the ornate doors elsewhere in the castle, this one was plain wood, undecorated except for a small brass handle. Elena tried the handle. The door opened easily, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward. "We should check it out," Elena said, more to herself than to Sophie. If there was a basement, it might be warmer, protected from the wind that whistled through the castle's upper floors. They descended carefully, Elena's flashlight casting strange shadows on the stone walls. The staircase was steep, the steps worn smooth by years of use. It felt older than the rest of the castle, more fundamental, as if it had been built first and everything else constructed around it. At the bottom, they found themselves in a corridor lined with more doors. Elena tried the first one. Locked. The second, also locked. But the third door opened, and what lay beyond made Elena freeze in disbelief. It was a chapel, small and intimate, carved entirely from the same gray stone as the castle above. But unlike the frozen emptiness upstairs, this space felt different. The air was still cold, but not quite as bitter. And in the center of the room, set into the floor, was another door. A trapdoor, heavy wood banded with iron, and beside it, a ring set into the floor for lifting. Sophie tugged at Elena's coat. "What is it?" "I don't know, baby." Elena approached the trapdoor slowly, her heart pounding. Every instinct told her to turn around, to take Sophie back upstairs, to find a room where they could huddle through the night and leave this place at first light. But something stronger than instinct pulled her forward. Curiosity, maybe, or desperation, or the thin, persistent hope that had kept her moving forward through every disaster and disappointment. She grasped the iron ring and pulled. The trapdoor was heavy, but it moved. Hinges groaned, breaking through decades of stillness. Elena strained, putting her whole body into the effort, and finally the door swung open, revealing darkness below and a smell that was different from the rest of the castle. Not the smell of decay or abandonment, but something else. Something that made her think of old churches and safe deposit boxes and places where valuable things were kept. Stone steps led down into the darkness. Elena descended first, Sophie following close behind, one small hand clutching the back of Elena's coat. The steps were steep and narrow, carved directly into bedrock. They descended for what felt like a long time, going deeper than Elena had expected, deeper than seemed reasonable for a building this size. At the bottom, her flashlight beam found walls. Stone walls, smooth and deliberate, forming a chamber roughly 20 feet square. The ceiling was an arch, expertly constructed, strong enough to support the weight of the entire castle above. And along the walls, built into alcoves cut from the rock itself, were shelves. On those shelves sat boxes, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, metal boxes, wooden crates, leather cases, all stacked with careful precision. Elena moved closer, her hands shaking. She set Sophie down and approached the nearest shelf. The boxes looked old but well-preserved, protected by the constant temperature and darkness of the underground chamber. She reached for one, a metal case about the size of a shoebox, and carefully lifted it down. The case was heavier than she expected. She set it on the floor and examined the latch. No lock, just a simple clasp. She opened it. Inside, nestled in velvet that had faded to a dull purple, were coins. Gold coins, dozens of them, each one heavy and substantial. Elena picked one up, holding it in the beam of her flashlight. The surface was marked with dates and symbols she didn't immediately recognize, but the weight, the color, the unmistakable feel of real gold told her everything she needed to know. Her breath caught in her throat. With trembling hands, she opened another box. More coins, these ones silver, also old, also valuable. She opened a leather case. Inside were documents, carefully preserved in protective sleeves, official-looking papers with seals and signatures. Sophie tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, what is it?" Elena couldn't answer. She moved along the shelves, opening box after box. Gold coins, silver bars, precious gems still in their original settings, stocks and bond from companies she'd never heard of, land deeds, certificates, documents that seemed to represent ownership of things she couldn't begin to understand. And in the very back of the chamber, in an alcove by itself, stood a large wooden chest reinforced with iron bands. Elena approached it slowly, feeling as if she were moving through a dream. The chest had no lock, just a heavy latch. She lifted it and opened the lid. Inside were more documents, but these were different. Organized, labeled, indexed. The top sheet was a letter, handwritten on heavy paper that had yellowed with age, but remained perfectly legible. Elena read it by flashlight, her eyes moving across words that seemed impossible. To whoever finds this collection, the letter began. "My name is August Constantine Hellstrom, and what you have discovered represents my life's work and my greatest shame." The letter went on, written in a flowing script that suggested education and formality. Hellstrom explained that he had been a prospector and investor in the early 1900s, one of many who'd come north chasing mineral wealth. Unlike most, he'd been successful, wildly successful. He'd discovered copper deposits, sold claims at the right time, invested in railroads and lumber and shipping. By 1920, he was one of the wealthiest men in Minnesota. But his wealth had come with a cost. He'd acquired land through methods he later recognized as theft. He displaced indigenous families, broken promises, used his money and influence to take what wasn't his. The chapel vault, he wrote, contained items he'd acquired throughout his life, things he knew should be returned, but couldn't bring himself to surrender while alive. I built this castle, the letter continued, as a monument to my success, but it became my prison. I could not enjoy what I had taken. I could not sleep soundly knowing the harm I had caused. So I gathered everything of value and placed it here in this vault beneath the chapel, waiting for someone with a better conscience than mine to discover it and use it properly. The letter was dated December 24th, 1938. Christmas Eve, exactly like today. Elena sat back, her mind reeling. Sophie had curled up beside her, fighting sleep despite the cold and strangeness of their situation. Elena looked around the vault, at the shelves lined with wealth, at the evidence of a man's guilt and his attempt at posthumous redemption. She thought about the locked doors upstairs, the abandoned grandeur, the frozen emptiness of a building that had once housed dreams of importance. August Hellstrom had died here, she realized, or left here. Either way, the castle had stood empty for decades, waiting for someone to find what he'd hidden. And now she had found it. Elena pulled Sophie closer, wrapping her coat around both of them. The vault was warmer than the rest of the castle, insulated by layers of stone and earth. They could stay here tonight, safe from the wind and cold. Tomorrow, she would have to figure out what to do, who to tell, how to handle a discovery that seemed too enormous to be real. But for now, on Christmas Eve, homeless and desperate, she and her daughter had shelter. And more than that, they had stumbled into something that might change everything. Sophie's breathing grew slow and steady as sleep finally claimed her. Elena held her daughter close, sitting in a vault full of stolen wealth and complicated history. And for the first time in months, she felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering their tracks, erasing the evidence of their arrival. The frozen castle stood silent in the wilderness, holding its secrets close. And deep beneath the chapel, in a vault that had waited nearly a century to be found, Elena Morrison began to plan for a future that suddenly seemed possible. The night passed slowly. Elena dozed fitfully, jerking awake every hour or so, disoriented by the darkness and the weight of what they discovered. Sophie slept more soundly, her small body warm against Elena's side, exhausted by the day's-long walk and the stress that had become their constant companion. When morning light finally filtered down through the chapel above, dim and gray, Elena carefully extracted herself from Sophie's embrace and stood up. Her body ached from the cold stone floor, and her breath still came out in visible clouds, but they had survived the night. That alone felt like a victory. She explored the vault more thoroughly in the morning light that managed to reach the lower chamber. The collection was even more extensive than she'd realized. She found jewelry in velvet-lined cases, necklaces heavy with diamonds, rings set with stones she couldn't name. There were paintings, small ones, rolled and stored in protective tubes. Sculptures wrapped in cloth. First edition books sealed in airtight containers. And everywhere, documents. Deeds to land throughout northern Minnesota. Stock certificates from companies long defunct or absorbed into larger corporations. Mining claims. Railroad rights. Timber contracts. Each one carefully preserved. Each one representing a piece of wealth that had been locked away for nearly 90 years. Elena's hands shook as she handled the papers. She had no idea what any of this was worth. Tens of thousands? Hundreds of thousands? The gold alone, if it was real, might be worth more than she'd earn in her entire lifetime. Sophie woke, rubbing her eyes. "Mama, I'm hungry." The The words brought Elena back to immediate reality. They'd eaten the last of their food yesterday, sharing a granola bar and an apple while walking through the snow. They had no supplies, no way to cook even if they had food. The castle offered shelter, but nothing else. I know, baby. We need to go back to town. Can we come back here? Elena looked around the vault at the wealth surrounding them and felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. I don't know. They climbed back up to the chapel, then continued to the ground floor. In daylight, the castle looked even more abandoned, even more impossible. Elena could see now that the building was in worse shape than she'd realized. Water damage stained the walls in several places. Parts of the ceiling had collapsed, letting in snow and rain. The elaborate carvings were crumbling, victim to decades of freeze-thaw cycles. Whoever had built this place had spent a fortune, but they'd built it in the worst possible location. No roads led here. No power lines connected it to civilization. It was a monument to ego and excess, beautiful and useless, slowly returning to the wilderness that surrounded it. Elena and Sophie squeezed back through the broken window and began the long walk back to Frost Lake. The morning was clear and brutally cold, the temperature still well below zero. Elena walked quickly, trying to generate heat, carrying Sophie when the girl's legs grew too tired. They reached town just before noon, both of them near collapse from exhaustion and cold. Elena headed straight for the public library, one of the few places that would be warm and open on Christmas Day. The librarian, a woman named Margaret who'd been kind to them before, took one look at their condition and brought them hot chocolate and sandwiches from somewhere. "Where were you last night?" Margaret asked, her voice gentle but concerned. "We found shelter," Elena said carefully. "An old building outside town." Margaret nodded, asking no more questions, respecting Elena's privacy in the way small-town people often did. She let them stay in the library's reading room, brought them blankets, told them to rest as long as they needed. While Sophie napped on a couch, Elena used one of the library's computers. She needed information, needed to understand what she'd found and what it might mean. She started with August Hellstrom, searching newspaper archives and historical records. What she found shocked her. August Constantine Hellstrom had been real, exactly as his letter described. Born in Sweden in 1875, immigrated to Minnesota in 1895, made his fortune in mining and real estate. The newspapers from the 1920s and 30s documented his rise, his wealth, his influence. They also documented his reputation. Harman, the articles said, ruthless businessman, someone who got what he wanted regardless of who stood in his way. The castle was mentioned in several articles. Hellstrom's Folly, they called it, built between 1928 and 1932, supposedly as a hunting lodge and retreat, though the scale suggested something more grandiose. The construction had employed dozens of local workers during the Depression, making Hellstrom both respected and resented in the community. But in 1938, everything changed. Hellstrom disappeared. One day he was there, conducting business, entertaining visitors at his castle. The next day gone. No body was ever found. No explanation ever given. The castle sat empty, and eventually the county seized it for unpaid taxes. Several attempts had been made to sell it, but no buyer emerged. Who wanted a massive stone building in the middle of nowhere with no road access and no practical use? Eventually, it was simply forgotten. The county still owned it, technically, but made no effort to maintain or monitor it. It existed in a bureaucratic limbo, too expensive to demolish, too remote to repurpose, slowly crumbling into ruin. Elena sat back, processing this information. The castle belonged to the county, which meant the vault technically belonged to the county. But the county didn't know the vault existed. If she reported her discovery, what would happen? Would they seize everything? Would she receive any kind of reward? Or would she be questioned, possibly accused of trespassing or theft, her story doubted, her intentions questioned? She thought about her situation. Homeless, broke, desperate. She thought about Sophie, who deserved stability, safety, a childhood that wasn't defined by uncertainty and fear. She thought about the letter in the vault, about August Hellstrom's claim that he wanted someone with a better conscience to find his collection and use it properly. What did that mean? Was it permission? An instruction? Or just the guilty rambling of a man trying to ease his conscience from beyond the grave? Elena didn't know, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She couldn't walk away. Not yet. Not without understanding what she'd found and what it might mean for her and Sophie's future. Over the next few days, Elena moved carefully. She found them a room at a weekly rate motel, using most of her remaining money. She took on extra cleaning work, anything she could find. In every spare moment, she researched. She learned about gold prices, about collectible coins, about how to authenticate old documents. She studied property law, inheritance law, abandoned property statutes. She read everything she could find about August Hellstrom, piecing together the story of a complicated man who'd built an empire on questionable foundations and apparently couldn't live with the guilt. The more she learned, the more she realized the vault's contents might be worth far more than she'd initially imagined. Some of those coins were rare, potentially extremely valuable to collectors. The stocks and bonds, if still valid, could represent ownership in companies or their successors. The land deeds might still be enforceable or might form the basis of claims against current owners. This wasn't just treasure. It was a legal and financial puzzle of staggering complexity. On New Year's Eve, exactly 1 week after finding the vault, Elena made a decision. She couldn't handle this alone. She needed help, professional help, from someone who could navigate the legal complexities without taking advantage of her desperation. She remembered something Margaret the librarian had mentioned in passing. Her son was an attorney in Duluth, specialized in estate law and property disputes. Elena asked for his contact information, and Margaret provided it without hesitation, along with a quiet word of support. "Whatever you're dealing with," Margaret said, "Jeremy will treat you fairly. That's the kind of man I raised." Elena called Jeremy Morrison that afternoon. She explained, carefully and without revealing too many details, that she discovered something significant in an abandoned property and needed legal guidance. He agreed to meet with her, pro bono given her circumstances, and they set an appointment for the following week. As Elena hung up the phone, Sophie looked up from the coloring book Margaret had given her. "Mama, are we going to be okay?" Elena pulled her daughter close, feeling the fragile weight of hope mixed with fear. "I think so, baby. I really think we might be." Outside, snow fell softly over Frost Lake, covering everything in white. And 30 miles north, hidden in the wilderness, a frozen castle kept its secrets, waiting to see what Elena Morrison would do next. Jeremy Morrison's office sat on the 3rd floor of a renovated warehouse building in Duluth's Canal Park district. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Superior, where ice had begun to form along the shore in geometric patterns that shifted with each wave. Elena sat in the waiting room, Sophie beside her working quietly on a puzzle the receptionist had provided, and tried to calm a nervous energy that made her hands shake. She'd rehearsed what she would say 100 times during the 2-hour bus ride for Frost Lake. Each version sounded less believable than the last. A homeless woman discovers a hidden vault full of treasure in an abandoned castle. It sounded like a fairy tale, the kind of story desperate people told themselves to make poverty bearable. But it was true. She had the photographs on her phone to prove it. Dozens of images documenting the vault, the shelves, the boxes, the letter from August Hellstrom. She'd also brought copies of some of the documents she'd carefully removed from the vault during a second visit, going back alone while Sophie stayed with Margaret at the library. Land deeds, stock certificates, pages from Hellstrom's letter. Physical evidence that this wasn't delusion or fantasy. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, smiled at her. "Mr. Morrison will see you now." Elena took Sophie's hand, and they entered the office together. Jeremy Morrison stood to greet them, and Elena felt some of her anxiety ease. He was younger than she expected, maybe 40, with his mother's warm demeanor and an air of genuine interest rather than the polished detachment she'd feared from an attorney. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, then paused. "I'm sorry, are we related?" "Morrison isn't exactly uncommon, but no relation," Elena said quickly. "It's my married name." Well, ex-married name. I kept it because changing everything back seemed like more trouble than it was worth. I understand completely. Please sit down. He gestured to comfortable chairs arranged around a low table rather than the formal desk setup Elena had anticipated. Can I get you anything? Coffee, water? And for Sophie? I think we might have some juice boxes if you'd like one. Sophie nodded shyly, and the receptionist appeared moments later, with apple juice and a plate of cookies. These small kindnesses, Elena had learned, could unmoor her faster than cruelty. She blinked back tears and focused on the reason she'd come. Your mother said you specialize in estate law and property disputes. That's right. I also handle some probate work and occasionally get involved in cases involving abandoned property or unclear ownership. Mom mentioned you'd found something significant in an abandoned building. Elena took a deep breath. It's more than significant. It's impossible, and I need help understanding what I'm legally allowed to do about it. She pulled out her phone and showed him the photographs. Jeremy's expression shifted from polite interest to focused attention as he scrolled through the images. When he reached the photos of Hellstrom's letter, he stopped and read carefully, zooming in to see details. This is August Hellstrom's castle, he said quietly. I know about this property. The county's been trying to figure out what to do with it for years. You know about it. Anyone who works in property law in this region knows about it. It's a cautionary tale about building monuments to ego in impractical locations. The structure is technically owned by the county through tax foreclosure, but there's been ongoing debate about whether it should be demolished, sold, or somehow repurposed. The cost of demolition alone would be substantial, and there's asbestos to deal with, potential environmental issues. He looked up from the phone. But this vault, this changes everything. Elena felt her stomach tighten. Ow! Jeremy set the phone down carefully. Before we go further, I need to understand your situation completely. How did you discover this vault? What have you taken from it? Who else knows about it? The questions weren't accusatory, but they carried weight. Elena understood she was at a crossroads. What she said next would determine whether Jeremy became her advocate or whether this meeting ended with advice to return everything and forget she'd ever been there. She told him the truth. All of it. The shelter turning them away on Christmas Eve, the desperate walk into the wilderness, finding the castle by accident, squeezing through the broken window to escape the cold. She described descending into the chapel, opening the trapdoor, finding the vault exactly as Hellstrom had left it. I only took copies of some documents, she said, and I photographed everything I could. I haven't removed any of the valuable items, the gold, the jewelry, any of that. I thought about it, she admitted. God, I thought about it. One of those gold coins would solve my immediate problems. But something stopped me. What stopped you? Elena looked at Sophie, who was focused on her cookies, then back at Jeremy. I kept thinking about Hellstrom's letter, about how he said he wanted someone with a better conscience to find it. If I started taking things without understanding the situation, without doing this properly, then I'd just be another person stealing. And I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, but I don't want to be a thief. Jeremy was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Okay, that's important. That's actually the most important thing you've told me. Why? Because it means we can approach this correctly from a legal and ethical standpoint. He pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. Here's what I need you to understand, Elena. This situation is extraordinarily complex. Under Minnesota law, abandoned property has specific legal definitions and procedures. The vault's contents could potentially be classified several different ways. Abandoned property, treasure trove, mislaid property, or even part of Hellstrom's estate. What's the difference? Everything. If it's abandoned property, the county as landowner would have the strongest claim. If it's treasure trove, which refers to hidden valuables whose owner is unknown, the finder typically has rights, though Minnesota law is murky on this. If it's mislaid property, meaning Hellstrom intentionally placed it there with the intent to return, that's different again. And if it's technically still part of his estate, we'd need to trace his heirs. Elena's head spun. I don't understand. I found it. Doesn't that mean anything? It means everything and nothing. Legally, you were trespassing when you found it, which complicates your position. But morally, and this matters more than you might think, You didn't break in with the intent to steal. You were seeking shelter during life-threatening conditions. Any reasonable court would consider that. So what do I do? Jeremy leaned back in his chair, thinking, we need to do this in stages. First, I want to hire an independent appraiser to assess the vault's contents. Not to take anything, just to document and evaluate. That gives us a factual basis for any legal claims or negotiations. Second, we need to research Hellstrom's estate thoroughly. Who were his heirs? Was there a will? How was his property distributed after his disappearance? Third, we need to understand the county's current position on the castle property itself. And then we negotiate. If the contents are as valuable as these photos suggest, there are multiple parties who might have claims. The county, any surviving Hellstrom heirs, possibly even the state of Minnesota. But you, as the finder, also have a position to negotiate from. Finder's fee, reward, possibly even a percentage of the total value, depending on how we structure this. Elena felt hope and fear warring in her chest. What's a finder's fee in a case like this? It varies enormously, anywhere from 10 to 50%, depending on circumstances, the nature of the find, and what we can negotiate. But Elena, I need you to understand something crucial. He leaned forward, his expression serious. This could take years to resolve. We're talking about potential legal battles with multiple parties, complex probate issues, possibly even federal involvement if some of those stocks represent significant value. This won't be quick money. Years. Elena's voice came out small. I don't have years. I have $40 and a weekly motel room. I know, which is why we need to think strategically about immediate steps versus long-term resolution. Jeremy made more notes. Here's what I propose. I take your case pro bono for now. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering. This case is fascinating from a legal perspective, and honestly, the publicity alone would be valuable for my practice. Plus, my mother would kill me if I charged a homeless woman trying to do the right thing. He smiled briefly. But I need your commitment that you'll be completely honest with me, that you won't take anything from that vault without my explicit approval, and that you'll let me handle all communications with authorities and other interested parties. I can do that. Good. Now, immediate term, we need to get you stable housing. I have a colleague who runs a transitional housing program for families. Let me make some calls. And Sophie, he looked at Elena's daughter, who'd been listening quietly. There's a good elementary school near that housing. Would you like to go to school? Sophie's eyes widened. Really? Really? Your mom's discovery might take a while to sort out, but that doesn't mean you should have to wait for normal things like school and a safe place to live. Elena felt tears spill over despite her best efforts to contain them. I don't know how to thank you. Thank me by being patient with this process, and by trusting that doing this the right way, even though it's slower, will work out better in the long run. Over the next 2 weeks, Jeremy proved as good as his word. He secured Elena and Sophie a place in the transitional housing program, a small apartment in a building that housed 6 other families in similar circumstances. It wasn't luxury, but it was warm, safe, and stable. Sophie enrolled in the local elementary school and surprised everyone, including Elena, by thriving despite all the disruption in her young life. Meanwhile, Jeremy worked behind the scenes. He hired Dr. Patricia Chun, an appraiser who specialized in historical artifacts and estates, and arranged for her to visit the vault. Elena accompanied them on a bitterly cold January morning, returning to the frozen castle for the first time since New Year's. Dr. Chun was a small woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and an air of absolute professionalism. She spent 6 hours in the vault, photographing, documenting, taking careful notes. She handled each item with reverence, murmuring occasionally to herself as she worked. When she finally emerged, her expression was carefully neutral, but Elena could see excitement barely contained beneath the professional facade. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Chun said as they sat in the chapel above the vault, her breath visible in the frozen air. "I'll need weeks to complete a full appraisal, but preliminary assessment? We're looking at a minimum of $20 million, possibly much more." Elena felt the room tilt. 20 million? Conservative estimate. Some of these coins are extremely rare. The paintings, if they're authentic, and I believe several are, include works by artists whose pieces rarely come to market. The stocks and bonds will require financial analysis, but if even a fraction have retained or increased value, we're talking about substantial sums. And the land deeds. Dr. Chin shook her head. Those represent property throughout northern Minnesota. Some of it is probably worthless now, absorbed into state or federal lands. But some of it might still be privately held or have resource value. Jeremy was making rapid notes. Can you have a preliminary report ready within a month? 2 weeks if you need it urgent. This is the kind of discovery that comes along once in a career. I'll make it a priority. As they drove back to Duluth, Elena sat in the passenger seat of Jeremy's car, watching the frozen landscape pass by, trying to process what $20 million meant. It was more money than she could truly comprehend. Enough to change not just her life, but Sophie's life, potentially for generations. But it was also, she realized with growing unease, enough money to attract attention she didn't want. Her instinct proved correct. Within days of Dr. Chin's visit, despite everyone's attempts at discretion, word began to leak out. Someone had seen them at the castle. Someone else heard rumors. Small towns traded information like currency, and Frost Lake was no exception. The first reporter showed up at Elena's transitional housing on a Tuesday evening. She refused to answer the door, but that didn't stop the questions shouted through the wood. Mrs. Morrison? Is it true you found treasure at Hellstrom's castle? Can you comment on the estimated value? Do you have any statement about the county's claim to the property? More reporters followed. Then curiosity seekers, showing up at the housing complex trying to get a glimpse of the woman who'd made the discovery. Elena stopped taking Sophie to school personally, arranging instead for the school bus to pick her up inside the building's security entrance. Jeremy filed paperwork quickly, establishing a formal claim on Elena's behalf and simultaneously notifying the county of the vault's existence. It was a delicate balance, asserting Elena's rights as finder while acknowledging the county's ownership of the property itself. The county's response came within a week. A formal letter stating that all contents of the Hellstrom Castle, including any previously undiscovered rooms or storage areas, belonged to the county as part of the foreclosed property. They demanded immediate access to the vault and warned that any removal of items would be considered theft. Elena read the letter in Jeremy's office, her hands shaking. They're going to take everything. They're going to try, Jeremy corrected. But we have strong arguments. The vault was deliberately concealed, which means it wasn't part of the original foreclosure inventory. Hellstrom's letter expresses intent that these items be distributed properly, not simply absorbed into government assets. And there's precedent in Minnesota law for finders' rights, especially in cases of treasure trove. But they own the property. They own the structure. Whether they own everything that was hidden within it is a much more complex question. He pulled out another document. I've also been researching Hellstrom's estate. Here's where it gets interesting. He was declared legally dead in 1945, 7 years after his disappearance. His estate went through probate at that time, but the only assets were bank accounts and some stocks. Nothing about the castle was included because by then it had already been foreclosed for unpaid taxes. So what happened to his estate? It was divided between distant relatives in Sweden. But here's the crucial point. The vault contents were never inventoried as part of his estate, which means they may not have been properly distributed under probate law. If those Swedish relatives have any surviving heirs, they might have a claim too. Elena closed her eyes. This is getting more complicated, not less. Complex cases often do before they resolve. But Elena, I need you to trust the process. We're building a strong position. That position was tested sooner than expected. 2 days later, the county obtained a court order for immediate access to the vault. Jeremy fought it, arguing that proper archaeological and historical preservation protocols needed to be followed, but the judge sided with the county. Access would be granted within 72 hours. Jeremy arranged for Dr. Chun to be present during the county's inspection, along with a videographer to document everything. Elena wasn't invited, but Jeremy kept her updated by text as the process unfolded. County officials arrived with armed deputies, as if expecting resistance. They descended into the vault with Dr. Chun and Jeremy as witnesses. For 6 hours, they inventoried, photographed, and removed items, transferring them to secure vehicles for transport to a county facility. Elena watched the news coverage that evening, seeing boxes carried from the castle she discovered, loaded into trucks, driven away. The newscaster spoke excitedly about the Hellstrom treasure, estimated value now reported as possibly exceeding $30 million. Elena's name was mentioned repeatedly, though without her permission, her privacy eroding as the story grew larger. Sophie climbed onto the couch beside her. "Mama, why are they taking our treasure?" "It's not our treasure, baby. It's complicated." "But you found it." "I did, but finding something doesn't always mean you get to keep it." Sophie processed this with the serious expression she got when trying to understand adult concepts. "That doesn't seem fair." "No," Elena agreed quietly. "It doesn't." The next several weeks blurred together in a succession of legal meetings, document reviews, and media pressure. Jeremy filed multiple motions arguing for Elena's rights as finder. The county countered with arguments about property ownership. And then, unexpectedly, a third party emerged. A law firm representing the Hellstrom family heirs in Sweden filed a claim to the vault contents, arguing that the items had never been properly probated and therefore should be distributed according to inheritance law. Their claim was complicated by the fact that August Hellstrom's letter explicitly stated he wanted the contents to go to someone with a better conscience, arguably excluding his own family from inheritance. "This is actually helpful," Jeremy explained when Elena expressed frustration at yet another complication. "The more parties with claims, the more likely we end up in negotiation rather than winner-take-all litigation. And in negotiations, your position as finder and as the person Hellstrom's letter seems to address carries moral weight that translates to legal leverage." Dr. Chin's full appraisal came back in late February. The vault's contents were valued at $42 million. The figure made headlines across Minnesota and started to attract national attention. News trucks appeared regularly in Frost Lake. Feature stories ran about the homeless mother who'd discovered a fortune while seeking shelter from the cold. Some portrayed Elena sympathetically. Others questioned her motives, suggesting she must have known about the vault beforehand, that the whole story was suspicious. The attention was crushing. Elena stopped leaving the transitional housing except for absolute necessities. She withdrew, became quiet, focused entirely on Sophie and the legal process Jeremy was navigating. She felt herself disappearing into the story, becoming a character rather than a person, her life reduced to sound bites and speculation. Then in March, something shifted. A documentary filmmaker named Rebecca Torres reached out through Jeremy's office. She wanted to tell Elena's story properly, she said. Not the sensationalized treasure hunt version, but the human story of poverty, survival, and the complicated ethics of discovery. She proposed a long-form documentary that would follow Elena through the legal process, giving her control over her own narrative. Elena's first instinct was refusal. She had enough of cameras and questions. But Jeremy encouraged her to at least meet with Rebecca. "You're going to be in the public eye regardless," he said gently. "This way, you have some control over how your story is told. And honestly, positive public perception will help in negotiations. If people see you as sympathetic, as someone who deserves consideration, that creates pressure on the county and other claimants to settle fairly." Elena agreed to one meeting. Rebecca turned out to be different from the other media people Elena had encountered. She was in her 40s, thoughtful, more interested in listening than extracting quotes. She showed Elena her previous work, documentaries about economic inequality, about families navigating systems designed without them in mind. "I'm not interested in the treasure," Rebecca said. "I mean, it's fascinating, but that's not the story. The story is what happens when someone who has nothing finds something valuable. Do the systems we've built protect her? Exploit her? Ignore her? That's what I want to explore." Something in Rebecca's approach resonated with Elena. Maybe it was exhaustion with fighting, or maybe it was recognition that her story was going to be told whether she participated or not. She agreed to the documentary, with the stipulation that Sophie's privacy would be protected and that she could withdraw consent at any time. Rebecca began filming in April. She accompanied Elena to legal meetings, documented her daily life in transitional housing, interviewed Jeremy, Dr. Chun, and other principals in the case. She also did something Elena didn't expect. She researched August Hellstrom's history thoroughly. What Rebecca uncovered added new dimensions to the story. Hellstrom hadn't just been a ruthless businessman. He'd specifically targeted indigenous families, using legal loopholes and governmental corruption to acquire land that had been promised to Native communities. Several of the deeds in the vault represented property taken through these methods. This is important, Rebecca said, showing Elena her research. Hellstrom's letter says he wanted someone with a better conscience to handle this. Maybe that means more than just legal distribution. Maybe it means addressing the historical wrongs he committed. The idea took root in Elena's mind. She began researching the indigenous communities Hellstrom had displaced, learning about families who'd lost land, about promises broken, about ongoing struggles for recognition and restitution. She read about the complicated history of northern Minnesota, about treaties violated, about resources extracted and communities destroyed. And she realized something that changed her entire approach to the case. She didn't just want a finder's fee. She wanted to do something that mattered. In May, Elena called a meeting with Jeremy and Rebecca. Sophie was at school, and they sat in Jeremy's office with Lake Superior gray and cold beyond the windows. "I've been thinking about this wrong," Elena said. "I've been focused on what I might get from this discovery. But that's not what Hellstrom's letter asks for. He wanted someone to use this properly, to do better than he did." Jeremy nodded slowly. "I wondered when you'd get here. You knew. I hoped." Elena, from a purely legal standpoint, you could fight for maximum compensation. We have good arguments for a significant finder's fee. But I've watched you research Hellstrom's history, seen how you've reacted to learning about the families he displaced. I thought you might want to consider alternatives. What kind of alternatives? Jeremy pulled out a document he'd been working on, Elena realized for weeks. What if we propose a settlement structure that creates a foundation? The vault contents get liquidated through proper channels. The county gets a percentage for their costs, and as landowner, you get a percentage as finder, enough to establish real stability for you and Sophie. But the majority goes into a foundation dedicated to addressing some of the historical harms Hellstrom caused. Like what? Land restoration programs for indigenous communities, educational scholarships, economic development in areas Hellstrom exploited. We'd work with tribal councils and community organizations to determine priorities. The foundation would exist as a legacy, not of Hellstrom's guilt, but of your choice to do something better. Elena felt something unfold in her chest, a sense of rightness that had been absent throughout all the legal maneuvering. Would that even work? Would the county and the Swedish heirs agree? I think we can make a compelling case. The county would get funds without the political headache of being seen as profiting from historical wrongs. The Swedish heirs would get something rather than facing years of litigation with uncertain outcomes. And you, Jeremy smiled. You'd get to be the person Hellstrom's letter was written for. Rebecca had been filming quietly. Now she spoke up. This would be an incredible story. Not treasure hunter gets rich, but homeless mother creates legacy of repair and restitution. That's the kind of narrative that changes how people think about these issues. Elena thought about Sophie, about the kind of example she wanted to set. She thought about her own life, the mistakes and disasters and desperate choices. She thought about finding the castle on Christmas Eve, about reading Hellstrom's letter by flashlight in a frozen vault, about the strange sense she'd had that she was supposed to find this place. "Let's do it," she said. "Let's do it the right way." The proposal was submitted to all parties in June. It was detailed, carefully structured, and morally compelling. The county would receive 12% of the liquidated value, approximately $5 million. The Swedish heirs would receive 8%, roughly $3.4 million. Elena would receive 15% as finder, $6.3 million. The remaining 65%, approximately $27 million, would go into a foundation dedicated to addressing historical harms caused by August Hellstrom's business practices. The proposal sat in negotiation for weeks. The county was cautious, their attorneys picking apart every clause. The Swedish heirs were resistant at first, wanting a larger share, but eventually agreed when Jeremy pointed out that fighting Elena in court could result in them getting nothing at all. In late July, all parties signed the agreement. The treasure would be liquidated through auction houses and specialized dealers. The foundation would be established with proper oversight and community input, and Elena would receive the largest amount of money she'd ever imagined having. But the settlement came with something else Elena hadn't anticipated: vindication. The news coverage of the settlement was overwhelmingly positive. Stories ran about Elena's choice to dedicate the majority of the discovery to restitution rather than personal enrichment. Indigenous leaders praised the decision. Community organizations expressed gratitude. And slowly, the narrative shifted from homeless woman finds treasure to discovery becomes opportunity for healing. Elena sat in her small apartment, watching the news coverage with Sophie beside her. $6.3 million. Even after taxes, it was enough to transform their lives completely. Sophie could go to college, to graduate school if she wanted. They could buy a house, have security, never worry about shelters or food banks, or choosing between rent and medicine again. But more than the money, Elena felt something she hadn't felt in years: pride. She'd made choices that mattered, that looked beyond her immediate desperation to something larger. "Mama," Sophie said, leaning against her shoulder, "are we going to be okay now?" Elena pulled her daughter close, feeling the weight and warmth of her, this small person who'd survived so much. "Yeah, baby, I think we really are." Outside, summer had come to Duluth. The lake was blue instead of gray. Tourists walked the boardwalk. Life continued its rhythms of change and constancy. And in a lawyer's office downtown, documents were being prepared that would turn a frozen castle's secret into something that might actually heal old wounds. The frozen castle still stood in the wilderness, empty now of its treasure, but full of story. And deep in the vault beneath the chapel, August Hellstrom's letter remained, its purpose finally fulfilled by a woman who'd sought only shelter and found instead the chance to do something that mattered. The weeks following the settlement agreement brought a different kind of pressure, one Elena hadn't anticipated. Money, even promised money, changed how people looked at her. The other families in transitional housing became awkward around her, oscillating between congratulations and thinly veiled resentment. Why her? Why did she get lucky while they continued to struggle? Elena understood the feeling. 6 months ago, she would have felt the same way watching someone else escape poverty through sheer chance. But now, living it, she realized luck was more complicated than it appeared from outside. "You're going to need financial advisors," Jeremy told her during a meeting in early August. "People who can help you manage the settlement once it's dispersed. I can recommend several firms that specialize in sudden wealth management." Sudden wealth management? Elena repeated the phrase, feeling its strangeness in her mouth. "That's actually a thing. It's very much a thing. Lottery winners, inheritance recipients, people who sell businesses, they all face similar challenges. Having money doesn't automatically mean knowing how to preserve it or use it wisely. Statistics show that a significant percentage of people who receive sudden wealth end up in worse financial shape within a few years." Sophie was doing homework at the corner of Jeremy's conference table, but Elena could tell she was listening. Her daughter had become quieter as the legal process unfolded, more watchful. Elena worried about what all this attention and change was doing to her. "What do you recommend?" Elena asked. Jeremy slid a folder across the table. "I've put together information on 3 firms. All of them have experience with clients who come from limited financial backgrounds and need education as well as management. You should interview each of them, see who you're comfortable with. This is going to be a long-term relationship." Elena opened the folder, scanning names and credentials that meant little to her. "How do I know if they're good people? How do I know they won't just take advantage of me?" "You don't, not completely. But you look for firms with solid reputations. You ask for references, and you trust your instincts. You've made good decisions so far, Elena. Don't second-guess yourself now. That evening, back at the transitional housing, Elena sat at her small kitchen table going through the folder. The amount of money being discussed, management fees, investment strategies, tax implications, made her head spin. She'd gone from counting quarters for laundry to contemplating stock portfolios and trust funds. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Margaret, the librarian from Frost Lake, standing in the hallway with a covered dish. "Margaret, what are you doing here? Thought you might like some company and some home cooking." Margaret held up the dish. "Chicken casserole. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and there's enough for both of you." Elena felt tears prick her eyes at the simple kindness. She stepped aside to let Margaret in, and they sat together at the small table while Sophie ate casserole and Margaret caught her up on Frost Lake gossip. "Town's been crazy since the news broke," Margaret said. "Reporters everywhere for weeks, asking questions about you, about the castle, about Hellstrom. Some folks are angry the treasure's not staying local. Others think you're doing the right thing with the foundation. What do you think?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I think you're handling an impossible situation as well as anyone could. You could have grabbed what you could carry and run. Instead, you're trying to do right by history and by people you've never met. That takes character. Or stupidity," Elena said with a weak smile. "Sometimes those look similar from the outside. But I've watched you with Sophie these past months. The way you've protected her, kept her stable despite everything falling apart and then coming together again. You're a good mother, Elena. That's harder to be than rich." After Margaret left, Elena thought about those words. A good mother. Was she? She put Sophie through so much. The instability, the shelters, the fear. The discovery of the vault had given them a way out. But it also thrust Sophie into public attention she never asked for. The next morning, Elena received a phone call that complicated things further. A woman named Patricia Whitehorse, representing the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, wanted to meet with her. "We've been following the settlement agreement," Patricia explained when they met later that week at a coffee shop in Duluth. "The foundation you're proposing, it's meaningful. But we want to make sure Indigenous voices are centered in how it's structured and deployed." Patricia was in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that carried generations of hard-won wisdom. She sat across from Elena with the confidence of someone who'd spent years fighting bureaucracies and didn't scare easily. "I want that too," Elena said honestly. "But I don't know how. I don't know anything about tribal governance or community needs or any of this. I just know Hellstrom stole from your people, and the foundation should help address that. That's a start. Better than most starts, honestly." Patricia pulled out a folder thick with documents. "We've been researching the land deeds in Hellstrom's vault. Several of them represent property that was promised to Ojibwe families in treaties dating back to the 1850s. Those promises were broken through legal manipulation and outright theft. Hellstrom was just one of many who participated, but his documentation is unusual because it's so complete. What happens to those deeds now? That's what we need to discuss. Some of the land is now in state or federal hands, parks, forests, protected areas. That land isn't coming back, but some parcels are still privately held. If the foundation were to purchase those parcels and return them to tribal ownership, it would be a meaningful gesture toward restitution." Elena leaned forward. "Could we actually do that? With $27 million? "Absolutely. Not all of it, but significant pieces. We've identified approximately $8 million worth of strategically important parcels that could be acquired. Land that would support hunting, gathering, cultural practices that have been disrupted for over a century." The idea excited Elena in a way the abstract notion of a foundation hadn't. This was concrete. This was action that would change lives. How do we make that happen? You include tribal representatives on the foundation's board. You create protocols that require community input on all major decisions. You build relationships based on trust and accountability, not just good intentions. Patricia paused, "And you recognize that this work will be complicated, sometimes messy, definitely imperfect. Restitution isn't simple. Over the next several weeks, Elena worked with Patricia and Jeremy to restructure the foundation proposal. The board would include tribal representatives, historians, community organizers, and financial experts. Decision-making would be transparent and community-driven. The foundation's mission expanded to include not just financial support, but active land restoration, cultural preservation, and educational programs. Rebecca's documentary cameras captured much of this process. Elena had gotten used to Rebecca's presence, the quiet woman with cameras who seemed to understand when to film and when to simply witness. The documentary was taking shape as something larger than Elena's individual story. It was becoming a meditation on wealth, poverty, historical harm, and the possibility of repair. "I want to show Sophie watching the news coverage," Rebecca said one afternoon. "Just her reaction to seeing her mother talked about. Would that be okay?" Elena hesitated. She'd been protective of Sophie's privacy, limiting how much the documentary included her. But Sophie had been present for so much of this journey. Maybe her perspective mattered too. "Let me ask her," Elena said. That evening, she sat with Sophie and explained Rebecca's request. "You don't have to do it. This is your choice." Sophie, now 8 years old and somehow both younger and older than she should be, thought about it seriously. Will it help people understand? Understand what? Why you're doing this? Why you're giving most of the money away instead of keeping it for us? Elena pulled her daughter close. "Do you understand why?" "I think so. You said Mr. Hellstrom stole things and hurt people, and we have a chance to help fix that. And that's more important than having a lot of money. Does that make sense to you? Or does it feel like I'm choosing strangers over you?" Sophie was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes I wish we could just keep it all and have a big house and never worry about anything again. But then I think about living in shelters and people being mean to us and how scared I was. And if we can help other people not be scared like that, maybe that's better." Elena felt her heart break and heal simultaneously. "When did you get so wise?" "I don't know. I just pay attention." Sophie agreed to be filmed, and Rebecca captured a scene that would become one of the documentary's most powerful moments. An 8-year-old girl watching news coverage of her mother's decision to prioritize restitution over wealth, trying to articulate why that choice mattered even when part of her wish things were different. September brought another complication. A man named Curtis Hellstrom, claiming to be August Hellstrom's great-nephew through a previously unknown branch of the family, filed a legal challenge to the settlement. He argued that he deserved a larger share, that the Swedish relatives who'd signed the agreement didn't represent all potential heirs. Jeremy groaned when he showed Elena the filing. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. Once word gets out about money, relatives appear from everywhere. Is his claim legitimate? Maybe. We'll need to verify his lineage, which could take months. But even if he is related to Hellstrom, the settlement agreement was signed by the recognized heirs of record. Adding new claimants at this stage would unravel everything." The legal challenge stalled the disbursement process. Funds that were supposed to be released in October were now held pending resolution. Elena, who'd been planning to move out of transitional housing into a modest apartment, had to delay those plans. The uncertainty pressed in again, a familiar weight she'd hoped to escape. How long could this take? She asked Jeremy. Months. Maybe longer if Curtis Hellstrom fights aggressively. "I'm sorry, Elena. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear." Elena felt frustration building. "Why does it have to be this complicated? I found something hidden. We're trying to do the right thing with it. And people keep showing up with their hands out wanting more. Because that's what happens with valuable discoveries. Everyone wants a piece. But Elena, we've dealt with complications before. We'll deal with this one too." That night, unable to sleep, Elena found herself researching Curtis Hellstrom online. His social media presence painted a picture of a man who'd struggled financially, moved frequently, worked various jobs without much success. His claim to the Hellstrom fortune felt less like legitimate inheritance and more like desperation. Elena understood desperation. 6 months ago, she'd been that person, grasping at any opportunity to escape poverty. Curtis Hellstrom was doing the same thing, just with lawyers instead of shelters. The realization didn't make her less frustrated with the delay, but it added complexity to her anger. How many people were out there, struggling like she'd struggled, seeing this discovery as their salvation? How many would emerge from the woodwork claiming connection or rights or simple need? October brought an unexpected development. The National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., reached out expressing interest in some of the vault's contents for their permanent collection. Specifically, they wanted Hellstrom's letter and selected documents that illustrated the history of land theft and displacement in the Great Lakes region. This could be helpful, Jeremy explained. If we donate certain items to the museum, it establishes goodwill, demonstrates that the foundation is about education and preservation, not just financial transactions. Plus, donations to national museums can have tax benefits that increase how much actual cash the foundation has to work with. Elena liked the idea of Hellstrom's letter ending up in a museum, where people could read his confession and understand the complicated legacy they were trying to address. But she worried about losing control of the narrative. What if they tell the story wrong? What if they make it about Hellstrom's redemption instead of about the harm he caused? We negotiate that in the donation agreement, Jeremy said. We can specify how materials are contextualized, what educational materials accompany them, even have input on exhibition text. Museums want these items, which gives us leverage. While those negotiations proceeded, Rebecca's documentary team continued filming. They'd expanded their scope to include interviews with tribal elders, historians, and descendants of families displaced by Hellstrom's business practices. The documentary was becoming a broader examination of American wealth, how it was built, who paid the price, and what repair might look like. Elena watched raw footage one afternoon in Rebecca's editing studio. Seeing her own face on screen, hearing her voice discuss things that mattered, felt surreal. She barely recognized herself, not physically, but in the confidence with which she spoke about foundation goals and historical restitution. "You've changed," Rebecca observed, noting Elena's expression. "When we started filming, you apologized constantly. Now you advocate. That's significant growth. I don't feel like I've changed. I feel like I'm making things up as I go. That's what growth looks like from inside. But trust me, the difference is visible." November marked 1 year since Elena had found the vault. The anniversary brought renewed media attention and a flurry of retrospective articles about the discovery. Most were positive, praising Elena's choices and the Foundation's mission. But some were critical, questioning whether she was qualified to manage such a large initiative, whether the Foundation was really the best use of the funds, whether the whole thing was just performative guilt. The criticism stung. Elena found herself reading comment sections she knew she should avoid, seeing strangers dissect her choices and motivations. Some accused her of keeping too much money for herself. Others said she was giving away too much and being irresponsible to her daughter. The fact that these contradictory criticisms came from the same general pool of commenters didn't make them hurt less. "You can't please everyone," Margaret reminded her during one of her visits. "And you shouldn't try. You're doing something meaningful. That's always going to make people uncomfortable." Curtis Hellstrom's legal challenge finally resolved in December, almost exactly a year after Elena's discovery. His genealogical claims proved shaky. He was related to August Hellstrom, but through a line that had been explicitly excluded from inheritance in Hellstrom's original will. The judge dismissed his challenge and awarded attorney fees to Elena's legal team, which Jeremy waived rather than adding another financial burden to. "Curtis, he's struggling," Jeremy explained when Elena questioned the decision. "Making him pay would just push him deeper into debt. Sometimes the cost of being right isn't worth it." With the legal challenge resolved, the disbursement process finally moved forward. In January, 15 months after finding the vault, Elena received the first installment of her finder's fee, $2 million, with the remainder to follow over subsequent months as items were sold and liquidated. $2 million. The number was absurd, impossible, real. Elena sat in a financial advisor's office. She'd chosen a firm called Northwoods Financial that specialized in values-based investing and had experience with clients transitioning out of poverty, and watched as numbers appeared on screens, representing security she'd never imagined having. The first thing we recommend, her advisor Sarah Nakamura said, is paying off any debts and establishing an emergency fund. Then we look at housing, education savings for Sophie, and long-term wealth preservation. Elena had no debts except her accumulated guilt and worry, which money couldn't resolve. But the emergency fund, the housing, the education savings, those were concrete, achievable, transformative. Within a month, she'd moved out of transitional housing into a small 3-bedroom house in a Duluth neighborhood where Sophie could walk to school. The house wasn't fancy, built in the 1960s, needed updating, had a yard that would require work. But it was theirs. The mortgage was paid in full. No landlord could evict them. No shelter could turn them away. Sophie got her own room for the first time in her life. Elena decorated it carefully, letting her daughter choose paint colors and bedding and where to position furniture. Watching Sophie arrange her stuffed animals on a bed that would be there tomorrow and the next day and the day after that made Elena cry more than any of the legal victories had. "We're really staying here?" Sophie asked, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "We're really staying." The foundation's official launch came in March, 2 years and 3 months after Elena found the vault. The ceremony was held in Duluth's downtown event center, attended by tribal leaders, community organizers, historians, and hundreds of people whose lives would be touched by the foundation's work. Patricia Whitehorse gave the opening remarks, contextualizing the foundation's mission within the longer history of Indigenous resistance and survival. "This doesn't fix everything," she said clearly. "One foundation, even a well-funded one, cannot repair centuries of harm. But it's a start. It's an acknowledgement. And it's a partnership between someone who found something valuable and communities who lost something irreplaceable." Elena spoke briefly, her hands shaking despite months of preparation. She talked about finding the castle on Christmas Eve, about reading Hellstrom's letter, about the choice she'd made to prioritize repair over enrichment. "I'm not a hero," she said, her voice carrying across the crowded room. "I'm just someone who is desperate and cold and stumbled into a secret that changed my life. What I want people to understand is that we all have choices about what we do with our discoveries, our advantages, our luck. I chose to share mine because I remember what it felt like to have nothing, and because I believe we have a responsibility to address the harms of the past, even when we didn't personally cause them." The applause that followed felt different from the scattered, polite clapping she'd experienced at other events. This felt genuine, earned, meaningful. The Foundation's first major initiative was announced that day, the purchase of 3,000 acres of land that would be returned to tribal ownership, along with funding for a cultural center and language preservation program. It was exactly the kind of concrete action Patricia had advocated for, and seeing it become real filled Elena with a sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. Rebecca's documentary premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January of the following year. Elena and Sophie flew to Utah for the screening. Elena's first time on an airplane, Sophie's first time seeing mountains. They sat in a dark theater surrounded by strangers and watched their story unfold on screen. The documentary was called The Vault Beneath. It interwove Elena's personal journey with broader narratives about poverty, wealth, indigenous displacement, and the possibility of repair. Sophie's scene, where she talked about understanding why her mother gave most of the money away, became the emotional centerpiece that reviewers consistently highlighted. The film won the Documentary Grand Jury Prize and was subsequently purchased by a streaming platform for national distribution. Suddenly, Elena's story reached audiences far beyond Minnesota. She started receiving letters from people across the country, some sharing their own stories of poverty and struggle, others asking how they could support the Foundation's work, a few offering criticism or advice she hadn't requested. One letter stood out. It came from a woman in New Mexico who'd been displaced from her family's land decades ago through circumstances similar to what Hellstrom had orchestrated. "Watching your documentary," she wrote, "gave me hope that maybe the harm done to my family could be acknowledged too. Not fixed. I know it can't be fixed, but acknowledged. That matters more than you might think." Elena kept that letter on her desk, returning to it whenever the work felt overwhelming or the criticism too sharp. Acknowledgement mattered. Repair, even imperfect repair, mattered. 3 years after finding the vault, the foundation had grown beyond anything Elena initially imagined. It employed a full-time staff, had returned over 8,000 acres of land to tribal ownership, funded 5 cultural centers, established scholarship programs that had supported over 200 indigenous students, and partnered with universities on research documenting the full scope of Hellstrom's acquisitions and their ongoing impacts. Elena served on the board, but had stepped back from day-to-day operations, recognizing that indigenous leaders needed to guide the work directly. Her role became one of advocacy and storytelling, using her platform to raise awareness about historical injustice and contemporary repair efforts. Sophie thrived. She was 11 now, confident in ways Elena had never been at that age. She'd become something of a youth advocate herself, speaking at her school about economic justice and giving a presentation to her classmates about the foundation's work that impressed her teachers enough to invite her to present at a district-wide event. "You created this," Jeremy told Elena during one of their regular check-ins. "Not just a foundation, but a legacy. You could have taken the money and disappeared. Instead, you built something that will outlast all of us." Elena thought about that often. Legacy. It wasn't a word she'd ever imagined applying to her life. She'd been focused on survival, on getting through each day, on protecting Sophie from the worst of their circumstances. But somehow, through a combination of desperation, discovery, and choice, she created something that mattered beyond her individual story. The frozen castle still stood in the wilderness, though it was deteriorating faster now. The county had discussed demolition, but the foundation had proposed an alternative: stabilize the structure and turn it into a museum about the complicated history it represented. Hellstrom's wealth and theft, the indigenous communities he displaced, the decades of secrecy, and the eventual discovery and repair. The proposal was still being debated, funding sources identified, logistics worked out. But Elena hoped it would happen. She wanted people to be able to visit the place where she'd sought shelter and found purpose, to stand in the chapel above the vault and understand that history wasn't abstract or distant, but alive beneath their feet. On Christmas Eve, 4 years after her discovery, Elena and Sophie returned to the castle. They'd gotten permission from the county and made the drive north with Rebecca's cameras following. The forest was just as cold, just as silent as Elena remembered. They approached the building carefully, entering through the front door this time. The county had installed proper access for potential museum visitors. The interior was largely unchanged, frozen and empty, but the chapel had been cleaned and stabilized. Sophie stood at the top of the stairs, leading down to the vault. "This is where it all changed, isn't it?" "This is where everything changed," Elena confirmed. They descended together, mother and daughter, into the vault that was now empty of treasure, but full of meaning. Elena stood in the center of the chamber and thought about the journey that had brought her here, the desperation that drove her into the wilderness, the hope that made her open the trapdoor, the choice that transformed discovery into purpose. "What are you thinking about?" Sophie asked. "I'm thinking about how scared I was that night, how I thought we were going to freeze to death, how finding this place felt like a miracle." Elena looked around the stone chamber. But the real miracle wasn't the treasure. It was what we chose to do with it. Rebecca filmed them ascending from the vault one last time. The documentary's sequel, focused on the foundation's impact and Elena's continued advocacy, would end with this scene: a woman and her daughter climbing up from darkness into light, carrying with them the understanding that even the coldest nights could lead to warmth. Even the most desperate discoveries could become opportunities for healing. As they drove back to Duluth, Sophie asleep against the window, Elena thought about all the people the foundation had helped, all the land restored, all the voices amplified. She thought about the woman from New Mexico who'd written about acknowledgement. She thought about Patricia Whitehorse and Jeremy Morrison and Margaret the librarian and all the people who'd helped transform an impossible situation into something meaningful. And she thought about August Hellstrom, a man she'd never met, but whose guilt and hope had become entangled with her own story. His letter had asked for someone with a better conscience to find his hidden wealth. Elena didn't know if her conscience was better. She'd made plenty of mistakes, caused her own share of harm through the choices born of desperation. But she tried. When given the opportunity to choose between personal enrichment and collective repair, she'd chosen repair. That had to count for something. The lights of Duluth appeared in the distance, warm against the winter darkness. Home, a word that meant something now, something solid and safe, and theirs. Elena reached over and gently touched Sophie's hair. This child who'd survived so much and somehow remained kind, curious, hopeful. They were going to be okay. More than okay. They were going to be part of something larger than themselves. Part of a story about how sometimes the things we find in our darkest moments can become lights for others. The frozen castle kept its watch in the wilderness, no longer hiding secrets, but standing as a monument to the complicated truth that wealth built on theft could, with conscious effort and community partnership, be transformed into tools for justice. Not perfect justice. Patricia was right that one foundation couldn't repair centuries of harm. But justice enough to matter, repair enough to change lives, acknowledgement enough to honor those who'd been erased. And for Elena Morrison, who'd been homeless and desperate just 4 years ago, that transformation, from victim of circumstance to agent of change, was worth more than any amount of gold hidden beneath chapel floors. 7 years after Elena Morrison found the frozen castle, she stood in front of 200 high school students at Duluth East High School, waiting for the auditorium to quiet. She'd given dozens of speeches by now, but nerves still fluttered in her stomach before each one. Sophie, now 14 and sitting in the front row with her 8th grade class from the nearby middle school, gave her an encouraging thumbs up. "Thank you for having me," Elena began, her voice steady despite the nerves. "I'm here to talk about a night 7 years ago when I thought my daughter and I were going to freeze to death in the Minnesota wilderness, and how that night changed everything, not just for us, but for hundreds of families across this region." She told a story she'd told many times now, but it never felt routine. The details remained vivid. The desperation of Christmas Eve with nowhere to go, the impossible castle rising from the snow, the vault hidden beneath chapel floors, the choice that defined everything that followed. But now she had perspective, distance, the ability to see how that single night had rippled outward in ways she couldn't have imagined. The students listened with the particular intensity young people brought to stories about overcoming impossible odds. When Elena finished and opened the floor for questions, hands shot up immediately. "How much money did you actually keep?" A boy in the back asked, his tone hovering between curiosity and challenge. "After taxes, about $4.2 million from my finder's fee. The foundation received approximately $24 million, and other parties received their negotiated shares." "But you could have fought for more, right? Like, legally?" "Probably. My attorney thought we had arguments for a larger percentage, but I didn't want more. I wanted enough to give my daughter stability and security, and I wanted the rest to address the harm August Hellstrom caused. Both of those things happened." A girl near the front raised her hand. "Do you ever regret giving so much away? Like when you see other rich people with mansions and fancy cars?" Elena smiled. "I have a house I own outright. My daughter's college education is fully funded, and I sleep soundly at night knowing that the money I found is being used to restore land to indigenous families and support cultural preservation. I don't need a mansion to feel wealthy. Honestly, I feel wealthier now than I would if I kept everything and spent it on myself." More hands, more questions. How did she know which financial advisors to trust? What was it like being homeless? Did she believe in fate or God or luck? Was she worried someone would try to steal from her? Elena answered each question honestly, never sugarcoating the difficulties, but also never portraying herself as a hero. She was just someone who'd made choices, some good, many complicated, all of them human. After the presentation, several students approached her privately. One girl, thin and anxious-looking, waited until the others had left before speaking. "My family's staying at the shelter right now," she said quietly, not meeting Elena's eyes. "We got evicted last month. I just wanted to say, it helps to know someone else has been through that and came out okay." Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she encountered current versions of her past self. "What's your name?" "Alicia." "Alicia, here's what I want you to know. Being homeless doesn't define you. It's a circumstance, a temporary situation, not an identity. You're still you, still smart, still valuable, still deserving of good things. And there are resources that can help. Have you connected with the Northwoods Family Foundation?" "I don't think so." Elena pulled out her phone and made a call. Within 5 minutes, she connected Alicia's mother with a case manager at the foundation. Not the one Elena had started, but a different organization that specialized in housing assistance and family services. It was a small intervention, but Elena had learned that small interventions could shift trajectories. As Alicia left looking slightly less burdened, Sophie approached. "You're good at that." "At what?" "Helping people without making them feel like charity cases. You treat them like equals." "Because they're equals. They're just dealing with circumstances I remember. There's no hierarchy in struggling." They drove home together, Elena's practical Toyota navigating familiar streets. The house she bought 7 years ago had been updated gradually. New kitchen, refinished floors, a bedroom addition that gave Sophie more space as she grew into adolescence. But remained modest, comfortable rather than ostentatious, a deliberate choice that reflected Elena's values. Jeremy Morrison was waiting on their front porch when they arrived, holding a folder and wearing the expression that meant complicated news. "This doesn't look like a social visit," Elena observed, unlocking the door. "It's not. We have a situation with the foundation that requires board discussion, but I wanted to give you advance warning." Inside, over coffee that Elena had learned to brew properly, one of many small skills she'd acquired as her life stabilized, Jeremy laid out the issue. "The foundation has been approached by a development company about purchasing some of the land we restored to tribal ownership. They're offering an enormous sum, well above market value, specifically for a parcel in the Boundary Waters region. And the tribal council is considering it, divided on it. Some members see the money as an opportunity to fund other initiatives. Others view selling the land as a betrayal of the foundation's mission. The board meeting next week is going to be contentious." Elena stared into her coffee, processing. This was exactly the kind of complexity she'd hoped to avoid by stepping back from day-to-day operations. But she remained a board member, and her voice still carried weight. "What do you think we should do?" she asked. "I think it's not our decision to make. The land belongs to the tribal council now. They have sovereignty over it. Our job is to support whatever they decide, not to impose our vision of what's right. Even if we think they're making a mistake. Even then, that's what actual restitution looks like. Returning power, not just property. It means accepting that indigenous communities get to make their own choices, including ones we might disagree with." The board meeting the following week was indeed contentious. Held in the foundation's offices, a renovated historic building in downtown Duluth that the foundation had purchased 3 years ago, it brought together the 12 board members representing diverse perspectives and constituencies. Patricia Whitehorse, who'd been instrumental in shaping the foundation's mission, spoke passionately against the sale. This land wasn't restored so that it could be flipped for profit. It was restored because our people have a sacred relationship with it, a relationship that's been disrupted for over a century. Selling it now, even for a good price, undermines everything we're trying to accomplish. Thomas Bearcloud, another tribal representative, disagreed. "With respect, Patricia, our relationship with the land doesn't require us to reject economic opportunity. That parcel could fund a new school, support elders' care, create jobs. Our people need those things now. The land will still exist, still be part of our territory, even if the title changes." The debate continued for 2 hours, passionate but respectful, everyone acknowledging the legitimate values on both sides. Elena mostly listened, recognizing that this wasn't her fight to lead. When the board chair finally asked for her perspective, she chose her words carefully. "I think Jeremy's right that this is fundamentally a question of sovereignty. We restore the land specifically so indigenous communities could make their own choices about it. If we start second-guessing those choices, imposing conditions, essentially saying we'll return your land but only if you use it the way we think is right, that's not restitution. That's just a different kind of control. She paused, making eye contact with board members around the table. But I also think Patricia's concerns are valid. We should ask ourselves whether this sale serves long-term community interests or just provides short-term financial relief. Is there a way to get the funding Thomas mentioned without giving up the land itself? Could we use foundation assets to provide that support directly? The discussion shifted toward compromise. By the meeting's end, the board had agreed to provide funding for the school and elder care initiatives Thomas had mentioned, allowing the tribal council to retain the land while still addressing community needs. It wasn't a perfect solution, those rarely existed, but it honored both the principle of sovereignty and the foundation's original mission. As board members filed out, Patricia approached Elena. "You handle that well." Centered indigenous voices while still contributing meaningfully. "I'm trying to figure out where the line is between abandoning responsibility and overstepping boundaries." That's the right question to be asking. Most people in your position don't even recognize there is a line. Patricia smiled. "You've grown a lot since that first meeting 7 years ago when you were so worried about doing everything wrong." "I still worry about doing everything wrong. I've just gotten better at not letting that fear paralyze me." That evening, Elena returned home to find Sophie working on a school project spread across the dining room table. Papers covered every surface, printouts, and handwritten notes and photographs arranged in what looked like chaos but was probably Sophie's organizational system. "What's all this?" "History project. We're supposed to research a significant event in Minnesota history and present on its long-term impacts." Sophie gestured at the mess. "I'm doing the Hellstrom Castle discovery." Elena felt a complex mix of pride and discomfort. "You're researching us?" "I'm researching the foundation and land restitution efforts. We're part of it, but it's bigger than us." Sophie held up a printed article. "Did you know the foundation's land restoration work has been cited in 3 other states as a model for addressing historical theft? And there are 2 academic papers analyzing the legal framework you and Jeremy created?" "I knew about the papers. I didn't know other states were using it as a model." "Yeah, there's this whole movement now around restorative justice and indigenous land rights, and apparently what happened here was like a catalyst. Ms. Rodriguez says our foundation demonstrated that large-scale restitution was actually feasible, not just theoretical." Elena sat down, looking at the evidence of impact her daughter had assembled. She'd known intellectually that the foundation mattered, but seeing it documented this way, citations and models and academic analysis, made it real in a different way. "Can I ask you something?" Sophie said, her tone shifting to something more personal. "Do you think finding the vault was fate? Like, do you think we were meant to find it?" Elena considered the question seriously. "I don't know if I believe in fate like some predetermined plan, but I do think there are moments when circumstances align in ways that feel meaningful. We needed shelter that night. The castle was there. The vault was hidden but findable. And I made choices about what to do with what we found. Whether that's fate or coincidence or just the weird way life unfolds, I'm not sure it matters. What matters is what we did with the opportunity." That's kind of what I'm arguing in my paper. That the significance isn't in the discovery itself, but in the choices that followed. Lots of people find valuable things. Not everyone chooses to use them for repair. "When did you get so philosophical?" Sophie grinned. "I learned from watching you navigate this whole thing. You're always asking questions about what's right versus what's easy, what serves the community versus what serves us. That kind of thinking rubs off." The following month brought an unexpected visitor. A woman named Dr. Sarah Vance from the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History contacted Elena about expanding the museum's exhibition on the Hellstrom collection. They wanted to create an interactive display that would allow visitors to explore the ethical dimensions of valuable discoveries. Elena flew to Washington, D.C. for preliminary discussions, her first time in the nation's capital. The museum was overwhelming in its scale and significance. Hallways lined with artifacts that represented American history in all its complexity. Dr. Vance led her to a gallery where Hellstrom's letter was already displayed, protected behind glass, accompanied by contextual information about indigenous displacement and the complicated legacy of westward expansion. What we're proposing, Dr. Vance explained, is an expanded exhibition that uses your discovery as a case study in contemporary restitution efforts. We'd include not just historical materials, but documentation of the Foundation's work, interviews with tribal leaders, perspectives from multiple stakeholders. The goal is to show museum visitors that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's ongoing, and we have agency in how we address historical harms. What would you need from me? Several things. First, permission to use your story more extensively. Second, consultation on how it's presented. We don't want to create a narrative where you're positioned as a savior. That would undermine the actual work of indigenous communities who've been fighting for land rights and cultural preservation for generations. You're one actor in a much larger story. Elena appreciated the careful framing. I'm comfortable with that. What else? We'd like to include some artifacts from the vault that haven't been sold yet. Specifically, some of the land deeds and documents that illustrate how systematic the theft was. And we're hoping the Foundation would consider donating or loaning additional materials as the exhibition develops. Over the next several hours, they discuss specifics. The exhibition would open in 2 years, timed to coincide with the 10th anniversary of Elena's discovery. It would be the museum's first major exhibition focused specifically on contemporary restitution and restorative justice, using the Hellstrom case as an accessible entry point for visitors to engage with complex ethical questions. Flying home, Elena looked out at clouds painted gold by sunset and thought about legacy again. The frozen castle had been August Hellstrom's attempt at legacy, a monument to his success. But it had become a prison, a symbol of wealth built on harm he couldn't escape even in isolation. Her legacy was different. Not a building or fortune, but a choice that rippled outward. Land restored, communities supported, conversations started, models created. It wasn't dramatic or photogenic in the way Hellstrom's castle had been, but it was real, and it mattered. The 10th anniversary of the discovery approached with surprising speed. A decade seemed simultaneously like a lifetime and like yesterday. Sophie was 16 now, confident and thoughtful, already talking about colleges and careers. She wanted to study social justice and indigenous rights, unsurprisingly. The Foundation had shaped her worldview as much as it had shaped Elena's. The anniversary celebration was held at the frozen castle itself. After years of debate and planning, the county and Foundation had partnered to stabilize the structure and transform it into a heritage site. Not quite a museum. The building's remote location and structural limitations prevented full museum standards, but an interpretive center where visitors could learn about Hellstrom's history, the vault discovery, and the Foundation's ongoing work. The transformation had been careful and respectful. The grand rooms remained largely empty, their decay arrested but not reversed, serving as reminders of how monuments to ego inevitably crumble. But the chapel had been fully restored, and the vault below had been converted into an exhibition space, documenting the original discovery and everything that followed. On a cold December morning, exactly 10 years after Elena and Sophie had stumbled through the wilderness seeking shelter, several hundred people gathered in the clearing around the castle. Indigenous drummers opened the ceremony, their rhythms echoing through the forest. Patricia Whitehorse spoke about the Foundation's accomplishments. Over 15,000 acres restored, 8 cultural centers funded, 347 students supported through scholarship programs, and countless families assisted through various initiatives. But the numbers don't capture the real impact, Patricia said. The real impact is in the Ojibwe child who can now learn her language because the Foundation funded language programs. It's in the elder who returned to traditional hunting grounds that had been stolen from his grandparents. It's in the communities who now have resources to preserve and share their cultures on their own terms. That's what this Foundation has accomplished, and it started because one desperate woman made a choice to prioritize repair over enrichment. Elena spoke briefly, uncomfortable as always with being centered in a story that had grown so much larger than her individual experience. 10 years ago, I was terrified, she said simply. Terrified my daughter would freeze, terrified I'd failed as a mother, terrified we'd never escape the cycle of poverty and instability. When we found this castle, when we discovered the vault, my first thought wasn't about justice or restitution. It was relief. We'd survived the night. She paused, looking around at the faces gathered in the cold. Tribal leaders and community organizers, foundation staff and donors, journalists and documentary filmmakers, and Sophie standing near the front with Jeremy and Margaret. The choice to create the foundation, to prioritize restitution, that came later. It came after I learned about Hellstrom's history, after I understood what his wealth had cost other families. It came after I met people like Patricia, who'd spent their whole lives fighting for recognition and justice. And it came after I asked myself what kind of example I wanted to set for my daughter. She gestured towards Sophie. I wanted her to understand that we're all connected, that harm done to one community diminishes all of us, and that we have a responsibility to repair what we can when we have the opportunity. The vault gave us that opportunity. The foundation is how we try to honor it. After the ceremony, Elena walked through the restored chapel with Sophie and Jeremy. The space had been beautiful in its original conception, and the restoration had honored that beauty while adding new elements. Plaques now explain the building's history, the communities displaced, the ongoing work of repair. They descended into the vault, now equipped with proper lighting and climate control, where visitors could see photographs of the original discovery, copies of Hellstrom's letter, and exhibits documenting the Foundation's work. It's strange being down here again, Sophie said, looking around the space that had changed her life before she was old enough to fully understand what was happening. I barely remember that first night, just the cold and being scared, and you telling me everything would be okay. I had no idea if everything would be okay, Elena admitted. I was just saying what mothers say. But you were right. Everything did turn out okay. Better than okay. Jeremy smiled. You know what I find remarkable? 10 years of legal work, foundation operations, complex negotiations, and we never had a major scandal or crisis. No embezzlement, no public fights between board members, no disasters that undermine the mission. That's actually unusual for organizations of this size and visibility. Maybe we've just been lucky, Elena suggested. Maybe. Or maybe the foundation works because it was built on genuine principles instead of performative guilt. People can sense the difference. As they climbed back up to the chapel, Elena heard voices above, visitors exploring the castle, learning its stories. The heritage site had opened to the public that morning, and already people were arriving despite the remote location and winter weather. She stood in the chapel doorway, looking back down at the vault one more time, remembering that Christmas Eve when she descended into darkness, not knowing what she'd find. So much had changed since then. So much had grown from that single moment of discovery. But some things remained constant. The love she felt for Sophie. The commitment to doing right even when it was complicated. The understanding that wealth meant more than money. It meant security, purpose, connection, the ability to make choices that aligned with your values. Over the next several years, the foundation continued to evolve. New initiatives emerged based on community needs. The land restoration work expanded to include environmental protection and traditional ecological knowledge programs. Scholarship programs grew to include not just college funding, but support for traditional arts, language revitalization, and cultural leadership development. Elena's role shifted further into advocacy and education. She spoke at universities, consulted with other organizations attempting similar restitution work, and testified before state legislative committees about policies that could support indigenous land rights and cultural preservation. Rebecca's second documentary, following the Foundation's first 10 years, premiered at Sundance and won another prize. It was picked up by the same streaming platform as the first film, creating a two-part series that showed both the immediate discovery and its long-term impacts. Together, the documentaries reached millions of viewers, sparking conversations about wealth, justice, and repair that extended far beyond Minnesota. Sophie graduated high school with honors and was accepted to several prestigious universities. She chose the University of Minnesota, wanting to stay connected to the communities the foundation served. Her college essay, which she shared with Elena before submitting, reflected deeply on growing up in the shadow of the castle discovery. "I used to resent how public our lives became," Sophie wrote. "I wanted privacy, normalcy, the ability to just be a kid without reporters and documentaries and strangers thinking they knew our story. But I've come to understand that our story never belonged just to us. It belongs to everyone who's been affected by Hellstrom's theft, everyone who's benefited from the Foundation's work, everyone who's learned from watching how we try to navigate impossible choices. That's a responsibility, yes, but it's also a gift. The gift of knowing your life has meaning beyond yourself." Reading those words, Elena cried, not from sadness, but from recognition that Sophie had become the person Elena had hoped she would be. Thoughtful, compassionate, aware of complexity, but not paralyzed by it. 15 years after the discovery, Elena was invited to give the keynote address at a national conference on restorative justice. The conference was held in Seattle, bringing together activists, academics, tribal leaders, and policymakers from across the country. Standing before an audience of over 1,000 people, Elena felt the surreal nature of her journey. 15 years ago, she'd been cleaning vacation rentals for minimum wage, one missed paycheck from homelessness. Now, she was speaking to national leaders about systemic change. "I'm not an expert in restorative justice," she began. "I'm not a scholar or a policymaker or a community organizer who's spent decades doing this work. I'm someone who stumbled into an opportunity and tried to handle it responsibly. So I want to be clear. The success of the Hellstrom Foundation isn't because I'm special or wise. It's because I had the humility to listen to people who actually understood what repair required." She talked about Patricia Whitehorse and the tribal leaders who'd shaped the Foundation's mission, about Jeremy Morrison, who'd navigated legal complexities with integrity, about Margaret the librarian, who'd shown kindness to a desperate stranger, about all the people who'd contributed expertise, perspective, and labor to transform a discovery into something meaningful. What I've learned over 15 years is that repair is never simple or complete. We've restored 15,000 acres, but there are millions of acres still unrestored. We've funded education and cultural preservation, but there are still indigenous children who don't know their languages, still elders who've lost connection to traditional practices. The Foundation has done good work, but it hasn't fixed everything. It can't fix everything. She paused, looking out at the audience. But that doesn't mean it wasn't worth doing. Restorative justice isn't about achieving perfection. It's about acknowledging harm, supporting healing, and creating structures that distribute resources more equitably. It's about asking, how can we repair? Instead of, why should we bother when we can't fix everything? The speech was well received, generating discussion that continued long after the conference ended. But what mattered most to Elena was a conversation she had afterward with a young woman who approached her during the reception. "My name is Keisha," the woman said. "I work with a community organization in Detroit that's trying to address wealth extraction and displacement in Black neighborhoods. I've been studying the Hellstrom Foundation model, trying to figure out how to apply similar principles to our context." They talked for an hour about parallels and differences, about what had worked in Minnesota and what might need to be adapted for different communities and histories. Keisha was brilliant and passionate, exactly the kind of person Elena believed should be leading restitution efforts. "The thing is," Keisha said, "I keep running into people who say it's impossible, that we'll never get wealthy donors or foundations to support this kind of work, that it's too radical or divisive. How did you get past that resistance?" Elena thought about the question carefully. "Honestly, I had an advantage because I wasn't asking wealthy donors for support. I had found wealth that was literally built on stolen land, which made the case for restitution more straightforward. But even then, we faced resistance. What helped was being very clear about our mission and not apologizing for it. We weren't asking permission to address historical harm. We were stating that historical harm needed addressing and inviting people to be part of that work or get out of the way. That's bold. It's necessary. If you're always asking permission to pursue justice, you're giving veto power to people who benefit from injustice. Sometimes you have to just start doing the work and let others decide whether to join you. Flying home from Seattle, Elena reflected on how far she'd come, not just in circumstances, but in understanding. 15 years ago, she wouldn't have been able to articulate principles of restorative justice or speak confidently about systemic change. She'd been focused entirely on survival. But survival, she'd learned, wasn't an endpoint. It was a foundation. Once you achieved basic security, the question became, what do you build on that foundation? How do you use stability not just for personal comfort, but for collective benefit? The Hellstrom Foundation was her answer to that question. Not perfect, not complete, but genuine and ongoing. 20 years after the discovery, Elena turned 58. Sophie was 31, working as a policy advisor for a national indigenous rights organization, married to a man she'd met in graduate school, expecting Elena's first grandchild. The foundation was now run entirely by indigenous leadership, with Elena serving only as an honorary board member whose primary role was sharing the story and supporting fundraising. The foundation had grown beyond the initial endowment, securing additional grants and donations that had expanded its work throughout the upper Midwest. The frozen castle had become a significant heritage site, attracting thousands of visitors each year. School groups came for educational programs. Researchers used it as a base for studying the region's history. And every Christmas Eve, the foundation hosted a gathering where community members shared stories, honored ancestors, and celebrated the ongoing work of repair. Elena attended that year's Christmas Eve gathering with Sophie and her husband Marcus. It was snowing, gentle flakes drifting down through pine trees, covering the forest in white that glittered in the lights strung around the castle. Patricia Whitehorse, now in her 80s but still sharp and active, found Elena near the chapel entrance. 20 years, Patricia said. Can you believe it's been 20 years? Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Other times it feels like a different lifetime. It was a different lifetime. You were a different person. We all were. Patricia smiled. You know what I appreciate most about you, Elena? You never pretended this was your story to own. You understood from the beginning that you were part of something larger, and you stayed in that role without trying to take over or make it about you. I had good teachers, Elena said, nodding at Patricia. Inside the chapel, the gathering began. Stories were shared in Ojibwe and English, songs were sung, food was distributed. Elena stood near the back, watching and listening, feeling the warmth of community that had formed around this place and this work. Sophie approached, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. How are you doing, Mom? I'm good. Thinking about how different this Christmas Eve is from the one 20 years ago. Do you ever wish things had gone differently? Like, what if you'd never found the castle? Or what if you'd kept all the money? Elena considered the questions seriously. If we hadn't found a castle, we might have frozen to death. So I'm grateful we found it. As for keeping the money, I don't think I'd be happy if I'd done that. The foundation, the work it's enabled, the relationships it's created, that's brought me more satisfaction than any amount of personal wealth could have. Even though you could have been really rich, I'm really rich. I have a home I love, a daughter I'm proud of, a grandchild on the way, and purpose that gets me up in the morning. That's wealth that matters. As the gathering continued, Elena slipped away to the vault one more time. She descended the familiar stairs, now well-lit and safe, into the space that had been transformed into an exhibition about discovery, choice, and repair. Photographs lined the walls showing the vault as it had been when she first found it, boxes and cases filled with gold and gems. Other photos showed the foundation's work over 20 years, land being restored, cultural centers being built, students receiving scholarships, communities gathering to celebrate preserved traditions. In the center of the room stood a single display case containing a replica of Hellstrom's letter. The original was at the Smithsonian now, but this copy allowed visitors to read his words, to understand the guilt and hope that had driven him to hide his wealth and wait for someone with a better conscience to find it. Elena stood before the letter, reading words she knew by heart. I hope I was what you were looking for. she said quietly to August Hellstrom's ghost. I hope the Foundation did what you hope someone would do. I hope the harm you caused is being repaired, even in small ways, even imperfectly. Footsteps on the stairs announced another visitor. Marcus appeared, looking around the vault with the wonder people always showed the first time they saw it. Sophie said I might find you down here. Just pay my respects. To Hellstrom, to the moment that changed everything, to the choice that gave my life meaning. Elena gestured around the vault. This space represents both the worst of human behavior, theft, displacement, exploitation, and the possibility of repair. That's powerful. They climbed back up together, emerging into the chapel where the Christmas Eve gathering continued. Elena rejoined the celebration, sharing food and conversation, watching Sophie laugh with friends, feeling the deep contentment that came from knowing she was exactly where she was supposed to be. 25 years after the discovery, Elena was 63. Sophie had 2 children now, Elena's grandchildren, bright and curious and loved. The Foundation had become a permanent institution, its work expanding to include climate justice and environmental protection as extensions of its core mission around land and cultural preservation. Elena had largely stepped back from public speaking, content to let younger voices lead the conversations about justice and repair. But she still visited the frozen castle several times a year, still descended into the vault that had changed her life, still marveled at the strange path that had brought her from desperation to purpose. On one such visit, in early autumn when the forest blazed with color, she brought her grandchildren to see the heritage site. They ran through the castle's grand rooms, their laughter echoing in spaces that had once represented isolation and guilt, but now housed community and learning. In the vault, her grandson Thomas, named after Thomas Bearcloud, the tribal leader who'd helped shape the Foundation, looked at the photographs and asked, "Grandma, were you scared when you found this place?" "Very scared. I thought we were going to freeze to death that night." "But you didn't freeze. You found treasure." "I found something more important than treasure. I found purpose." Her granddaughter Amelia, older and more thoughtful, studied the replica of Hellstrom's letter. He was a bad man, wasn't he? He stole from people. He did bad things, yes. But I don't know if that makes him entirely bad. People are complicated. He spent the last years of his life trying to figure out how to make amends for his actions. That doesn't erase the harm he caused, but it shows he understood he'd done wrong. And you're the one who made amends for him? I helped create a way for amends to be made. But the real work has been done by indigenous communities who fought for justice long before I came along, and who'll continue that work long after I'm gone. I just had an opportunity to contribute resources to support their fight. That evening, after the grandchildren were back with Sophie and Marcus, Elena sat alone in the chapel watching sunset paint the forest in shades of gold and amber. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from poverty to discovery to purpose. She thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work. The students who'd received scholarships and gone on to become teachers, doctors, artists, leaders. The families who'd returned to restored land and reconnected with traditional practices. The communities who'd built cultural centers and preserved languages that had been nearly lost. She thought about Sophie, who'd grown from a scared 7-year-old into a confident woman making her own contributions to justice work. And about the grandchildren who would grow up knowing that their grandmother had been given an extraordinary opportunity and had chosen to use it for something larger than herself. As darkness settled over the forest, Elena descended into the vault one final time. She stood in the center of the space, surrounded by photographs and exhibits documenting 25 years of work, and spoke to the silence. "Thank you," she said simply, "for the shelter when we needed it, for the treasure that became a tool for repair, for the opportunity to matter, to contribute, to be part of something meaningful. Thank you." She climbed back up to the chapel, turned off the lights, and locked the door behind her. Outside, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and the forest was settling into its night rhythms. Elena walked to her car, started the engine, and began the drive back to Duluth. Back to her home, her life, her grandchildren, her community. back to the existence she'd built on the foundation of a desperate night 25 years ago when she'd sought shelter and found instead a destiny she never could have imagined. The frozen castle stood silent behind her, holding its stories, serving its purpose, waiting for the next day when visitors would arrive to learn about discovery and choice and the ongoing work of repair. And somewhere in that silence, if you listen carefully, you might hear the echo of Elena Morrison's voice telling her daughter that everything would be okay. A promise made in desperation that had somehow, against all odds, come true. Not because of treasure or luck or fate, but because one woman, when given the choice between enrichment and repair, between personal gain and collective healing, had chosen the harder path and never looked back. That choice, made in a frozen vault beneath chapel floors, had rippled outward for 25 years and would continue rippling for generations to come. Land restored would sustain families. Cultural programs would preserve knowledge. Scholarships would create opportunities. And the model would inspire others to ask themselves the same question Elena had asked. When you find something valuable, what do you choose to do with it? For Elena Morrison, the answer had been clear. You share it. You repair what you can. You build something that outlasts you. You create a legacy worth more than gold. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.